Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Saga of the Swamp Thing, Book 3. Now, this is Volume 3 of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing series. Now, the character of Swamp Thing was originally created by Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson. Now, Alan Moore took over this series in 1984, and his run lasted until 1987, but during that time, he reinvented this character so much that his Swamp Thing comics really are almost their own separate series, despite being in continuity with the older Swamp Thing comics. Now, Alan Moore's Swamp Thing comics were originally published in single magazine form by DC Comics, but now all the issues of his Swamp Thing series have been put together into a 6-volume graphic novel series, which has been put out by Vertigo. Now, I already reviewed volumes 1 and 2 of this series, and I'll leave links in the description below to where you could check out those reviews. Now, the issues collected in Volume 3 make up what I believe is called the American Gothic story arc, and I think this story arc actually continues on into Volume 4. I, of course, haven't read Volume 4 yet. Now, basically what this is this is kind of a collection of different stories. Like, there is an overarching story, and each story picks up where the previous story left off, but each story also very much stands on its own as individual horror stories, each dealing with their own themes. And also what you get here is each story deals with a different social issue going on in America, but it uses monsters or some kind of supernatural occurrence as a metaphor for all that. And this is also the introduction of John motherfucking Constantine, a character who really has gone on to become a fan favorite. Now, the volume opens up with a 2-part story called the Nuke Face Papers, and this one is about this vagrant who was exposed to nuclear waste, but somehow this didn't kill him, and if anything, nuclear waste is now the only thing keeping him alive. But everybody he comes in contact with ends up dying of radiation poisoning. But I thought this was an absolutely terrifying story, and Nukeface really is a scary character because of what he does to people, and also the character has sort of this like boogeyman or urban legend status in the town that he's originally from and the town that he comes to. But he's not an unsympathetic character because you really do get the idea that this isn't really his fault, and he also doesn't realize what he's doing to people, mainly because he's insane. But in a way, the fact that he doesn't realize that he's killing people actually makes him scarier in a lot of ways. But the story is really making a commentary on nuclear power, and it's asking, is this really the way to go? It's clean energy, and we do need clean energy, but if something goes wrong, things could seriously go freaking wrong. And it's a story that really does play into the fear of what nuclear radiation can do to people. Now, even though this story doesn't mention nuclear weapons or the Cold War or anything, this story was written in the 80s when we were pretty much at the height of the Cold War, so the fear of what nuclear radiation can do to people, like, those were very relevant fears at the time, and they're still very relevant fears. Now, Swamp Thing and Nukeface do meet each other, and Nukeface, without even meaning to, completely destroys Swamp Thing, but Swamp Thing doesn't actually die here. This is where Swamp Thing learns that even if his body is destroyed, he could still recreate his body, which very much comes into play throughout the American Gothic story arc. Now, the Nukeface Papers isn't considered to be part of the American Gothic story arc, however the events of the Nukeface Papers do lead directly into the events of the American Gothic storyline. Now, the American Gothic storyline actually begins with an issue called Growth Patterns, which is also the first issue to introduce John Constantine. But basically, in this issue, Swamp Thing is recovering from what Nukeface did to him, and then Swamp Thing Thing and Abby meet this mysterious man named John Constantine, who seems to know a lot more about them than he would have any right to know. Now, it's not so much explained here, but later on it's explained that Constantine is a paranormal investigator and a demon hunter, and he's also kind of a wizard as well, because he can practice black magic. But Constantine seems to know what Swamp Thing is. Now keep in mind, Swamp Thing doesn't actually know what he is. For the longest time he thought he was Alec Holland, who was transformed into this creature, but in the first 2 volumes of this series, it was revealed that Alec Holland actually died and he only inherited the memories of Alec Holland. Now, neither Swamp Thing or Abby trust Constantine, but in exchange for information, Constantine sends Swamp Thing on these different missions to different parts of America where there are these weird supernatural occurrences happening, and Swamp Thing has to take care of whatever these supernatural threats are. So, this leads into a 2-part story arc comprised of the issues Stillwaters and Fish Story, and basically the plot of this story arc is Constantine sends Swamp Thing to this town called Rosewood, but the thing is, this is a town that was flooded after a dam broke. So the town is completely underwater, and it's inhabited by vampires living in the water. And the vampires have a queen who has laid all these eggs, and they're now awaiting the birth of their children. But this was a really cool story, and a really unique take on the vampire mythos, especially by the end of it. But here's the thing about this story, the vampires in it are really just doing what they have to survive. So in this story, you really are left to wonder, is Swamp Thing not the true antagonist when he's going after these creatures who, as I said, really are just acting according to their nature? And then that leads into a story called The Curse. Now, the plot of this story is Constantine sends Swamp Thing to this small town in Maine where there's a werewolf running around. And the werewolf is a housewife who has gotten the werewolf curse put on her. And this story definitely has sort of a feminist undercurrent. Like, there's a lot of commentary in this story on misogyny and gender roles and the ways in which women are viewed in our society. And the main character of this story is somebody who's very much sick of the restraints that society puts on women. And when this woman becomes the werewolf, it's almost like the ultimate manifestation of her feminine strength and her feminine fury. But this was a great story, and it does end really tragically. And the cool thing about this story is you can read it as part of the overall American Gothic story arc, or you can read it as a standalone horror story. Now, Volume 3 ends with a 2-part story arc comprised of the issues Southern Change and Strange Fruit. And this is where Alan Moore is really confronting the social commentary head-on. Now, this is a ghost story that's very much dealing with racism and the slavery of America's past. And it's very much showing a parallel between the racism of the past and modern-day racism. But the plot of this story is they're filming a TV series at this plantation where back in the 1840s, a slave owner killed one of his slaves after this slave was apparently sleeping with his wife, or at least the slave owner saw it that way. And what happens is the actors in this TV show start to become possessed by the spirits of people that were there, and also spirits of dead slaves end up coming back to seek retribution. And then Swamp Thing comes in to try to put an end to this horror. But this is a powerful story that's really confronting the ugliness of America's past. And this is probably my favorite of all the stories in here, and I liked how at the end there's a little bit of a Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead reference, like you see the posters for Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead at a movie theater. But yeah, this entire volume was great, and what's great about this is, as I said, it works as both a collection of short stories, but all the stories do tie together, and reading them all in a row, it does tell one big story. backstory. And throughout this entire book, you do get a lot of hints that something is coming. There's something catastrophic and possibly apocalyptic on its way, and Swamp Thing needs to prepare for this. And Constantine is a fantastic character. Like, he's an asshole, but he's kind of a likable asshole. Like, he's sarcastic, he's cynical, and you really do see why this character went on to become so big. And the character is also drawn to look like Sting from The Police. Like, had they made a movie based on these comics back in the 80s when these comics were published, Sting would have made the perfect John Constantine. Now, the character of Constantine was eventually spun off into his own comic book series called Hellblazer, which wasn't written by Alan Moore. Actually, that series was written by several different writers over the years. And the character has appeared in other DC and Vertigo comics as well. Now, the Hellblazer comics were adapted into the 2005 film Constantine with Keanu Reeves. Now, personally, I love the 2005 Constantine movie. Yes, I know it's not a faithful adaptation of the comics, like, it changes everything from the comic books, but I still really enjoy that movie as a standalone horror film. Like, yes, it's a bad adaptation of the comics, but as a standalone movie, I think it's really good. But I know that's not a popular opinion. Now, there was also a TV series adaptation of the Constantine comics, which was definitely a little more true to the source material. Now, I've never seen the show, but I heard it was pretty good, despite getting cancelled, but I believe the show Constantine is also set in the same universe as the show Arrow, because I know Constantine from that show did show up in a few episodes of Arrow, and I think now he's a reoccurring character on that show Legends of Tomorrow. So yeah, that was my review on Saga of the Swamp Thing, Book 3. Now, I haven't read the other volumes of this series yet, and I'm gonna hold off on that for a while, only because I want to space this out a little bit. But before I end this video, I want to cut to two short reviews that two friends of mine did on this book. The first short review was done by my friend Chris, and the other short review was done by my friend Christian Feliciano.
So going into book 3, we see Alan start to settle into a groove. He knows what he wants to do with the character. Abby's dedicated to him. They got rid of Arcane. So what comes next? And thankfully the answer is Constantine, who's one of my all-time favorite characters. Definitely like top 10 of all time. He brings like such a cool presence to the story, you know. I love it so much because you have just like this like snooty British dude coming into the mix and sort of almost commissioning Alec to go on missions. And then on top of that, you also have these kind of brief in-between arcs where you see Alan messing around with horror tropes. The 2-issue arc with the water vampires and the one shot with the werewolf, those are really cool acknowledgments of like classic horror stories and also guidebooks as to, okay, here's how you change it up. You know, the water vampires was about basically a community that just wants to do its own thing, and that thing that it wants to do is unfortunately what they're considered monsters for. And then with the werewolf, that was all just like feminine fury and feminine power, unbridled feminine power. And that's probably actually my favorite issue of the book, just because I have an affinity for werewolves. But it's almost like a jarring tonal shift going into the slavery arc, because you went from kind of these two straightforward horror stories into something that was much more depraved and much more about the rotten history of America and how we look at that through the lens of a horror story. And then it comes with such a tragic, sad ending with the undead uncle coming back and resigning himself to this job in a box, basically, you know, like a metaphorical coffin almost. So this kind of like dark rumination of the sins of America's past. And it's so interesting that this was written by a British dude. Guys like Alan and Warren Ellis, they're just like dudes who have their finger on the pulse so much that they can write these satires of countries they're not even from. It's so incredible. So book 3 is I think Alan messing around with different ideas and seeing what sticks and just trying to have fun for a little bit, exploring ideas. And we owe it because it brought in Constantine, who eventually thankfully got his own book and became as much of a mainstay of the DC universe as Swamp Thing, in some ways even more of a mainstay. And then also plays in later stories in the book, because the whole big hint that there's stuff coming. Swamp Thing has to prepare himself for what comes next. And what comes next is pretty fantastic. So if you haven't read books 4 to 6, definitely check those out. And also, I just want to give a plug for that TV show that they're working on, because I think it's going to be fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to it. So check that out if you can.
My name's John Constantine. I'm not the nicest bloke you've ever met, but I do me best. Those are the words of one of the greatest characters I have ever encountered. John Constantine, Hellblazer. Oh my god, I love this character to death. If you ever asked me who is my favorite of Alan Moore's creations, I will always say John Constantine. I love this guy's story to death. My introduction to John Constantine, funny enough though, was not this book. This is his introduction, don't get me wrong. This is when he was created. However, my introduction to John Constantine was the movie Constantine. And me and that movie did not get along well. After reading the comic books, we got along fine in the beginning. It was fine. It was just like a nice little relationship. You started out beautiful. Then all of a sudden, midway, you're like, I'm not digging you anymore. That's pretty much me in that movie. Because when you read the Hellblazer comics, the storyline is so much better than the movie. The character John Constantine is so much better than he is in the movie. And in this book, Alan Moore just created an icon. This is a beautiful character. And yeah, the entire book is not just John Constantine, it's Swamp Thing and his adventures, but the fact that John Constantine is introduced into this book makes this one my favorite of the series. This is my favorite volume of the entire series. I love this book to death. This is one of the greatest books I've ever read. Alan Moore's writing is top-notch as always. Like I said in the last review, he gives every character their voice, and John Constantine has a voice. He is the quintessential douchebag, but you just love him for it. He's British. He's amazing. He's a smoker, a chain smoker, and just a fantastic character. I didn't want my entire review to just be about John Constantine, but oh my god, the character is just amazing. And when you read this book, which I highly recommend reading the first two first and then getting to this one, you will see how amazing this book is, how amazing that character is. And then you'll probably want to pick up any other John Constantine stuff. But just to warn you, the Hellblazer series is not written by Alan Moore. I don't know if he ever wrote any Hellblazer comics at all. I just know that when you read the Hellblazer books, they're not written by Alan Moore, but that doesn't mean anything because the books are still amazing. Yes, I would have loved to see what Alan Moore could have done with John Constantine in those books, but still, fantastic books either way. And yeah, this is his introduction. Read this book. It's fantastic. Highly recommend it. Like I said, read the first two first, and then get to this one. And yeah, I really think that if you love Alan Moore, if you love horror, if you love science fiction, fantasy, all that stuff, and you like when they mix together well, and if you like comic books, but you've never read Swamp Thing, you'll definitely enjoy this series. Highly recommend it. Thank you, and bye-bye.